You want to know the truth? Here it is. The moment you stop chasing, the moment you stop waiting, begging, or hoping, he feels it deeply, instinctively, like something important is missing, because men don't return to women who plead. They return to women who rise, to women who grow silent, still, grounded, not out of weakness, but out of realized value. That's the version of you he can't forget. That's the version of you he keeps coming back to. Emotional detachment is not indifference. That's a mistake people make, confusing stillness with apathy. It's not about not caring. It's about having the courage to care without falling apart when someone else doesn't meet your need for validation. That's hard. That takes discipline. And what most people don't realize is that this kind of emotional control isn't something you simply decide to have. It's something you build through pain, through reflection, through choosing to act consciously rather than react impulsively. Most women, especially those who love deeply, are taught that giving is the way to be loved. Be available, be supportive, show him you're there. And of course, those are beautiful things. But when that giving becomes excessive, when it turns into chasing, into begging, into constant proving of worth, it backfires. Because what you're saying psychologically is this, I don't believe I'm enough unless you confirm it. And what happens next is brutal. The more you reach out, the more he pulls back. The more you explain, the less he listens. And your value in his eyes begins to diminish, not because you're not valuable, but because your actions suggest you don't know it yourself. Emotional detachment then is not a weapon. It's not something you use to manipulate someone into coming back. It's the result of an internal process where you've re-centered yourself in your own identity. You're no longer standing on shaky ground. You've stopped basing your emotional climate on someone else's presence or absence. You've reclaimed sovereignty. And that's when everything begins to shift. When a woman detaches emotionally, not by pretending, but by actually recalibrating her nervous system, something primal awakens in the man. He notices it, even if he can't explain it in words. Because energy doesn't lie. When you're truly indifferent, not cold, not spiteful, just steady, he feels the change in the relational dynamic. You're not seeking his response anymore. You're not checking your phone. You're not analyzing his tone. You're simply living. And that silence, that non-responsiveness, it disorients him at first. Not because you've done something cruel, but because the usual cues are gone. The dance he once knew, the reassurance, the chasing, the emotional availability, it's all disappeared. Now, he's looking at you through a different lens. The woman who once anxiously waited is now simply unavailable, not because she's playing games, but because she finally saw the game for what it was and stepped off the board. And here's the fascinating psychological truth. Most men only truly confront the reality of their feelings when faced with absence. When she was always there, he never had to question what she meant to him. He never had to feel the void. But now he's sitting in the silence she used to fill, and it hurts. That's where clarity is born. Men are wired evolutionarily to pursue what holds value. If something is always present, always predictable, always responsive, it loses its psychological grip on their attention. But once that energy is removed, once it's self-contained, its perceived value multiplies. Not because it changed, but because it stopped trying to be seen. Think of it this way. Imagine standing in front of a painting that's always been in your hallway. You walk by it every day. You might glance at it. Maybe you even liked it once. But now it's just there, part of the background. But the moment someone takes it down, the space feels different. Something's missing. And suddenly, you begin to wonder, why did I stop appreciating it? Did I even understand its worth? That's what emotional detachment does. It creates space. Space for reflection, space for longing, space for truth. But none of that works if you're pretending, if your silence is laced with passive aggression, if you're detaching just to provoke a reaction. Because that's not detachment. That's emotional manipulation, and it always backfires. True detachment comes from healing, from looking in the mirror and saying, I deserve peace more than I deserve this anxiety. I deserve freedom more than I deserve breadcrumbs. It's painful. Letting go of the need to be understood, to be chosen, to be validated. It's one of the hardest things a person can do. But once you cross that threshold, once you realize you are complete regardless of who sees it, that's where your power begins. That's where he starts to see what he missed. That's when he begins to return, not to the girl who needed him, but to the woman who doesn't. When you spend your life proving yourself, you become a mirror that reflects whatever the other person demands. One day you're the life of the party woman who laughs at jokes that aren't funny because laughter scores points. The next day you're the stoic counselor who listens in silence to every complaint because listening earns another fragile ounce of approval. You contort, you shrink, you stretch, every movement calculated to avoid rejection. And each shapeshift whispers the same corrosive lie: I am only as valuable as the response I can extract from you. That's how a soul erodes, one small compromise at a time, until you wake up and can't recognize whose life you're living because your own fingerprints are nowhere on it. Choosing yourself is the antidote. It's the inner declaration that says, enough of the circus. That declaration is terrifying because the moment you stop performing, you risk exposure. If they don't applaud the real you, there's no costume left to blame. So you cling to the masquerade even when it bruises you, because rejection of a persona feels safer than rejection of your core. Yet the price of that safety is bondage. You exchange freedom for a dimly lit cage built from other people's expectations they might discard tomorrow without warning. Psychologically, this shift from proving to choosing is a realignment of the internal locus of control. When your worth is outsourced to external validation, your emotional state fluctuates like a kite in erratic wind. But when you ground that worth in self-chosen principles, honesty, dignity, responsibility, you tether the kite to something immovable. There will still be gusty criticism, indifference, misunderstanding. The difference is that wind no longer dictates the direction of your flight, it merely tests the strength of your line. Story after story echoes this truth. A client once told me she spent years crafting the perfect text messages, studied punctuation like it was sacred geometry, just to keep a lukewarm relationship alive. When she finally sent a plain, honest sentence, no emojis, no triple checking, she was convinced the silence that followed meant disaster. 3 weeks passed. Then a message arrived. I've been thinking about what you said. Something's different. Can we meet? That difference was her sincerity. When you choose yourself, your words lose the anxious tremor that people sense even when they can't articulate it. They hear steadiness instead of static, substance instead of strategy. And steadiness is magnetic precisely because it is so rare in an age of chronic performance. There is a biological underpinning here as well, dominance hierarchies. Even infants can detect confidence versus desperation in vocal tone. Adults read those cues instinctively. When your posture says, I choose, serotonin networks in your observer's brain light up differently than when your posture says, please choose me. They may not consciously register why, but they feel the shift from scarcity to abundance, from demand to invitation. That neurological response translates into respect, and respect is the fertile ground where attraction grows roots deep enough to weather conflict. Yet choosing yourself is not an act of aggression, it is an act of order. Chaos is endless appeasement, unpredictable boundaries, a self that dissolves in every new context. Order is the quiet decree. These are my lines. I will not ridicule myself to amuse you. I will not dilute my convictions to keep peace that is merely the absence of truth. Some will bristle at that firmness. Let them. Their resistance is simply data revealing who was invested only in the pliable version of you. Others will lean in, intrigued by the unfamiliar sight of someone who stands, not in defiance, but in centeredness. Imagine 2 concentric circles. The inner circle is your essential identity, values, vision, dignity. The outer circle is behavior, laughter, listening, acts of service. When proving is your mode, those circles invert. You plaster effort onto the surface, hoping it will seep inward and crown you worthy. But effort never flows upstream to identity. Worth must radiate outward. Choosing reestablishes proper geometry: core first, action second. You give because you are generous, not to secure permission to exist. You speak gently because you are strong, not because you fear conflict. That inversion of motive changes the very texture of your presence. Consider the mundane example of walking into a crowded room. The proving mind scans faces for approval, calibrates tone, deciphers every raised eyebrow as either a threat or an invitation. The choosing mind scans the same room for resonance. Where can I contribute authentically? Who here values the kind of dialogue I enjoy? The first approach is survival. The second is collaboration. Collaboration invites respect, whereas survival invites exploitation. Wolves smell prey faster than you can fake confidence. Choosing yourself also means accepting solitude as a legitimate season, not a sentence. Many avoid the shift because they fear the interim loneliness. They think, if I stop proving, people will leave. Some will, yes. But what remains or arrives next will align with your unmasked self. That alignment is worth the vacancy period. Better an empty house than one filled with tenants who vandalize the walls of your psyche with graffiti that says, not enough. And when men encounter a woman comfortable in that vacancy, they sense an ecosystem too healthy to tolerate weeds. They either ascend to higher standards or they wander elsewhere, freeing the soil for something worthy to grow. The irony, of course, is that when you no longer need the return, that's when the return often happens. Not because you plotted some psychological chess move, but because you ceased bending reality to fit your craving. You left space for reality, his reality, to catch up with yours. And if it doesn't, you're no worse off. You're already home. The proof of success is not whether he circles back. It's whether your internal weather remains calm regardless of his orbit. Freedom is measured in how little someone else's distance can storm your inner sky. So the next time you feel the itch to perform, pause. Let the itch burn without scratching it. Observe the panic that says you must fill every silence, must reply within seconds, must turn yourself into the exact shape that fits his transient appetite. Then breathe and remember appetites change, but authentic character ages like oak. Choose to stand like that oak, roots deep, branches reaching unafraid of seasons. Some will seek your shade, others will pass by. What matters is that you remained a tree, not a weather vane. There's a profound difference between being mysterious and being manipulative, and people often mistake one for the other. To be mysterious is not to withhold for the sake of control, but to guard for the sake of dignity. It's not about silence designed to create confusion. It's silence rooted in self-possession. The woman who understands this principle doesn't disappear to provoke fear of loss. She simply doesn't announce herself in spaces where her energy is not being respected. And in that quiet withdrawal, in that chosen absence, something powerful happens. Her presence begins to echo louder than any words ever could. You see, in a world that rewards oversharing, exposure is cheap. We've been conditioned to believe that to be known is to be constantly visible, documented, explained, justified. But when you give everything away too soon, your thoughts, your emotions, your body, your past, you leave nothing to be discovered, nothing to be earned. And psychologically, what is not earned is not valued. That's the hard truth no one tells you. Mystery, then, is not a tactic, it's a boundary. It's an internal decision to preserve the sacred parts of yourself until the space feels safe enough, worthy enough, stable enough to receive them. Because the woman who tells her whole story to a man she barely knows is not being vulnerable, she's being reckless with her soul. Vulnerability must be earned. It must be paced. When it's rushed, it becomes a weapon that turns inward, carving self-doubt into the deepest places of your being. There's something incredibly magnetic about a woman who doesn't feel the need to explain herself, who listens more than she speaks, who doesn't respond to every message, not because she's playing hard to get, but because she's genuinely immersed in a life that fulfills her, whether or not he's part of it. That kind of energy unsettles people, especially men who are used to being pursued, accommodated, or worshipped. It forces them to wonder, to reflect. To question what about her is different. And that wondering becomes a slow burn, a psychological grip that doesn't let go easily. Let's be honest, many men are not used to having to earn intimacy. Not emotional intimacy, not physical intimacy, not spiritual access. They're used to doors opening wide with the first compliment, the first text back, the first sign of attention. So when the door doesn't open all the way, when it opens just enough to signal warmth, but not enough to flood out everything, you invite a different type of response. You're no longer broadcasting availability, you're radiating discernment. And discernment creates value. It implies that not everyone gets to know you. That access to you is not free. That love for you is not an act of desperation, but of deliberation. You don't need anyone to complete you. You've already built something whole within yourself. If someone comes, it must be as a co-creator, not a rescuer. And men feel that. They feel it on an instinctive level. Because in evolutionary psychology, men are wired to pursue what challenges them, not in a game-playing way, but in a purpose-driven way. They are biologically more likely to invest in what is scarce, what requires effort, what reflects quality. If you are always available, always eager, always accommodating, the value signal gets lost. You become a default, not a decision. There is incredible feminine power in stillness, in being rooted, in not chasing. A woman like that doesn't fear being alone. Her solitude is not a punishment. It's a garden where her mind and soul are cultivated. Sure, she knows that intimacy is sacred, that not every conversation needs to be had, that some things are better observed than confronted, and that some silences are more powerful than 1,000 words shouted into a void. That doesn't mean she's passive. It means she's intentional. If a man texts, she might respond, but not instantly, not reflexively. If he's inconsistent, she doesn't complain. She simply withdraws, because she understands that energy doesn't lie, and that what people do is always louder than what they say. She doesn't argue for her value. She doesn't plead to be seen. She walks away not because she wants attention, but because she refuses to participate in her own devaluation. And paradoxically, that's when the shift happens. That's when the man, previously indifferent, starts to pay attention. Not because she manipulated him into it, but because her absence triggered a discomfort he didn't expect. The silence he once found peaceful now becomes unsettling. He remembers her steadiness, her presence, the way she didn't demand but simply was. And he wants it back, not the attention, but the woman who wasn't trying to be needed. But that return, if it happens, is no longer the goal. Because the woman who embraced her mystery, who preserved her inner sanctum, no longer waits for validation. She recognizes it when it arrives, but she doesn't depend on it. She's not performing for approval. She's observing for alignment. And if the man who returns doesn't meet that alignment, she lets him go again. This time with no heartbreak, no second guessing, because she's no longer fighting for love. She is love, self-contained, grounded, quiet in her power. And that kind of woman, she's unforgettable, not because she made the most noise, but because she remained whole even in silence. They never come back while you're still emotionally begging them to. That's the painful paradox. As long as your mind is filled with, maybe if I just say this, or if I do that, he'll finally realize, or he must feel what I feel, you're still emotionally entangled. You're still stuck in the illusion of control, hoping that some perfectly crafted sentence or gesture will bring him back. And here's the hard truth that energy repels more than it attracts. Not because you're not worthy, but because you've unknowingly become emotionally available in a way that lacks boundaries, dignity, and finality. A person doesn't feel your absence until you truly leave, and not physically. Most people are physically gone. They delete numbers, block accounts, throw away photos. But inside, they're still holding on, clinging tightly to what could have been. They replay conversations. They study social media posts like sacred texts. They analyze silence as if it's speaking to them. That's not letting go. That's emotional captivity. And people can feel it. Even if you never say a word, there's a certain energy, a frequency when someone hasn't truly detached. It carries desperation, a kind of open loop waiting to be closed. And the other person knows. They sense the hook is still there waiting. That's not strength. That's vulnerability masquerading as patience. But something profound happens the moment you finally stop. Not pretend to stop, not use silence as a tool, not detach as a performance to lure them back, but when you truly stop, when the craving to be understood dies out, when the hope burns out, when the fantasy collapses under its own weight, that's when your emotional field shifts. And this shift isn't loud. It's not vengeful. It's not even visible. It's quiet, but it's real. You start showing up differently. You don't check your phone. You don't imagine what they'd think of your posts. You stop measuring your growth through the lens of their potential return. And in that moment, something returns to you. Your self-respect, your clarity, your peace. And this energy, this new psychological alignment becomes incredibly powerful. Because now your worth is no longer tied to their presence. And when someone can feel that you're no longer emotionally available to be manipulated, postponed, or breadcrumbed, they realize they've lost something. There's a concept in depth psychology that says people don't see the truth when it's in front of them. They see it in the void it leaves behind. And that's why the return only ever happens after you've emotionally left. When you were still reaching out, still needing closure, still subtly hoping, they had no reason to change. You were still feeding the bond, even if indirectly. But when you step away fully, when the bond goes unfed, it starts to dissolve. And the other person suddenly finds themselves alone, not just physically, but existentially alone. This is where the internal alarm begins to ring. Where did she go? They think. Why doesn't she care anymore? And this thought is terrifying. Not because they've lost control, but because they've lost access to the one thing they were certain would always be there. And certainty breeds complacency. But loss, real loss, that shakes the soul. That forces confrontation. Yet, here's the strange part. By the time they come back, you might not want them anymore. Not because you hate them, not because you're angry, but because in the space of your silence, you've changed. You've healed. You've restructured the architecture of your identity without them in it. And now, the version of you that once longed for their return no longer exists. That's the beautiful tragedy of growth. It creates distance between who you were and who you've become. You might still remember the feelings, the hope, the nights you cried yourself to sleep, but you no longer live there. It's just a memory now, one that shaped you, but no longer defines you. And if they do return, they'll notice the shift. You're warmer, perhaps, but less accessible, kinder, but less attached. You listen, absorb, you smile, but your eyes say, I'm not waiting anymore. And this difference, the one they can't quite explain, is what haunts them. Because now the connection feels one-sided. The power has shifted not because you took it, but because you stopped giving it away. People come back for many reasons. Loneliness, nostalgia, regret. But the ones who stay are the ones who meet the new version of you with respect, not confusion. They don't expect you to shrink back to who you were. They rise to match who you've become. And if they can't, you don't beg, you don't explain. You simply keep walking, not to prove anything, but because forward is the only direction that still fits. This is what it means to truly leave. It's not about severing ties with bitterness. It's about walking away so deeply that even if they knock on the door again, your soul doesn't flinch. You remember what it cost you to beg. You remember the way it drained you to chase fragments of attention. And you choose peace over performance. It's only when you no longer need them back that they finally realize what they lost. But by then, you're not the woman they left behind. You're the woman who finally came home to herself. So if you want to know what makes a man come back, it's this: stand still in your value. Don't speak to prove. Don't react to noise. Become so secure, so rooted, that your silence becomes the loudest echo in his mind. And remember, the ones who return aren't drawn to the woman who waited. They're drawn to the woman who grew,